All right.
So, if you wouldn't mind, just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the space industry in the first place.
I, from a very early age, I've always been inspired by astronomy and by space. And I started off studying physics and astronomy at university with the intent to go into a space career. But life diverted me off on some different paths. And I ended up getting involved in the world of policy and international relations, which in 2016 nicely came together when I got a job at the European Southern Observatory, which is an intergovernmental organization for ground based astronomy, as the international relations officer. So I'm dealing in responsible for the external relations of the organization, but this is in a organization that is there to enable and to build world leading telescopes. So that is how I came into this field. And right now, my job entails going to the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is really fascinating, and dealing with some of the impacts that there are on astronomy at the moment. So one of these is coming from the increasing number of low Earth orbit satellites. So the project by Mr. Elon Musk, his Starlink constellation, is potentially very beneficial, but can have some impacts on astronomy. So I'm trying to deal with some of these
Interesting. And
issues.
were you a sci-fi nerd when you were a kid, or not so much?
I am still a sci-fi nerd.
Which particular genre is your favourite?
Yeah, read fairly widely, I think, in sci-fi. I recently finished the
Okay.
Expanse series. I guess you probably know they
Yeah.
turned it into a really nice TV show, and I thought that was a really interesting series, exploring how humanity develops in the solar system and all the conflicts and tensions
Yeah.
that will
I'm
emerge.
actually still working my way through the Frank Herbert the Dune series, which is a frame of reference that spans 30,000 years. So it's quite a long it's quite a long piece to work your way through, and gets a bit woo woo as you go through the books. Actually, I don't know whether you've read any of Frank Herbert's books, but
Yeah, the first one is absolute gold, and then it's yeah maybe declines, but it's still
it
worthwhile
does
reading,
get
I
a little
think.
bit woo woo out there. But so do you expect to go to space yourself?
I am hoping that in the near future that the cost of space travel will reduce enough, and that projects like Virgin Galactic, for example, will work out, and that eventually going to space will just be like buying a plane ticket. That this traveling in an airplane for 12 hours to get to the other side of the world will be history, and that we'll just simply go up in a suborbital flight and we'll be there in 30
Yeah.
minutes. So that's what I'm hoping. I'm also a little bit nervous, I think, to go further afield, although conceptually I'd love to go and stand on the surface of Mars. I think I feel a little bit nervous about it because there's so many risks.
Yeah. To say
No.
there's
Yeah, I think that if you think back 100 years ago, right, and you were asking me the same question, oh, would you fancy going in an airplane ride? And it probably seemed really scary, and maybe only the really adventurous people would do it. But I think that maybe in 20 years' time, it could be that it's like taking an airplane ride, and it's not as scary, and all the various risks have been ruled out, and it's safe. So if the opportunity arose, I would absolutely be there like a shot. Uh, I think to have the experience to walk on another planetary body, this is just something.
how did you actually make that transition from a physicist and a scientific background into more of the policy sector within space? Was that a natural transition, or was there some particular thought process that you came across that moved you in that direction?
Yeah, I don't think it's one. It's as a result of kind of happenstance and circumstances, but I've always been drawn to trying to understand what the fundamental aspects of a situation. So this is what drew me to studying physics and astronomy. Like I wanted to know what is the fundamental nature of reality, and was really interested in all the theories of gravity and your superstring theory, like the fundamental nature of reality. And I've always been interested in how we organize ourselves as a species. and how does politics play out? And I think that's one of the interesting things about studying political science and on a broader scale international relations, that you start to understand some fundamental aspects about society. And I think that these two aspects in my mind went together, and I found myself wanting to know how to apply those things to help science. And that's how I ended up where I am. I don't know if I'm doing it successfully yet, but that was
Are
the
you
basic reason.
finding? Are you seeing people who have skills and a background in administration and policy getting involved in the space industry, or is it still scientists and engineers?
And I think its contribution, I still think, is the technically orientated people, but I think that as the sector is growing, and now we've got space tourism, like we just mentioned, we've got the growth of satellite constellations, that there's now projects for manufacturing things in space, space-based solar power, beaming solar energy collected in space down to Earth, and lots of different types of applications, not to mention all the classic ones like telecommunications and military and astronomy and scientific research. And going even a bit further, dealing with all the data that's coming from space and dealing with the use of data in space. So how do we manage all the systems that are up there? What are the implications of using artificial intelligence to manage spacecraft operations? So there's just a huge range of legal and governance and policy and regulatory issues that are starting to become apparent with our expansions in space. So I think this is why now is a really interesting time to become a space lawyer or a space policy expert. It's just because there's so many issues out there that we need to figure out as a species. So I recommend for your show that you talk to some scientists and engineers, but you should also talk to some space lawyers who can provide a very
Yeah,
interesting
absolutely. I've
perspective.
actually had some conversations with some space artists as well who are trying to convey the message through art as to what's going on, what the future is. It's
Yeah,
very.
and that's an interesting point in itself, right? Because I think one of the tropes out there about why space is important is that, oh, it inspires people to go into science and engineering, which it does, but I also think it inspires people to go into art and social sciences. So it's not just limited to science. It's something
And
very broad.
indeed, when you were involved in your early career, were you fairly unusual in being interested and involved in space?
Of course, in any field, there's always like a sort of hardcore group of people that are really interested in it. And early on, I was in that group. But as I then went out, I think I experienced a fairly low awareness of the sector. But from my perception now, I think that it's starting to change quite a bit. You see these periodic spikes, like right now we're in a kind of spike period because of the James Webb Space Telescope first images that came back, and also the launch 6 months earlier. And I think hopefully in the future there'll be some spikes when the Artemis mission to the moon launches next year, and maybe even the first Martian mission. But I think overall the trend is increasing, and I think this is a result of just the excitement and the kind of inspiration of the field. Things like social media is changing the accessibility to the space world, and really raising awareness. So I think that it's growing. However, uh, there's another side to this, that there's also a kind of counter narrative out there, which is questioning the value, and particularly as we have people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, who are essentially billionaires having their own private space programs, and people are then questioning, well, is that the right place where humanity should be? Why don't they spend money on solving climate change instead on Earth? And I think there's some valid points of criticism there, but yeah, so there's this kind of slight tension,
And
raising awareness.
there's two things I think in juxtaposition there that are interesting to explore. One is the role of the policymaker versus the explorer, and because the reality, if you look back at the NASA funding of the space program, and the breaking away of the behemoths of the old space program with some seed funding into SpaceX, rather than NASA wanting to build all its own rockets. I'm a private private capital to come in and build the rockets, and that's made a significant difference in the amount of money that is actually in the development that has actually gone into the US space program. Although I think this particular NASA administrator is a bit more old school than maybe the last ones, but it's interesting around it's public money that's funding that, isn't it? At the end of the day, it was public money, American public money, so that's fine. But that was funding the early development of SpaceX with the contracts that were awarded into SpaceX. So it was done for the taxpayer, effectively. It was a policy decision that the taxpayer should get some reward from. And I think they are in America. And that makes it interesting to understand what's the responsibility then of the policymakers to explain back to the taxpayers why those decisions are made 5-10 years ago. And that's that communication flow with our audience, which for a policymaker is very often the taxpayer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something important that we're often thinking about is how to justify what seems like quite a substantial expense. The James Webb Space Telescope is a perfect example. It's $10 billion in total. Okay, this was spread out over quite a long time period. The annual cost, I'm not sure it's actually that much in the overall US government budget, but yeah, in totality, it's still quite a lot. And here's where it's one aspect of it is justifying these things on their own intrinsic value because they're just exciting and important things to do, which is where I like to start. The James Webb Space Telescope, it is going to leave a legacy of knowledge for humanity to access for the rest of our existence. And this, to me, this is something amazing, and it's enough justification. And the moment when humans first set foot on Mars, this is like a watershed moment in the existence of our species. So that, I think, is worth it in itself. But then you can point to the secondary benefits, right? The various technology spin-offs that come out as a result of the investment in all these new technologies and projects. So the various spin-offs that weren't initially imagined, but then happened as a result. And the fact that we're employing large numbers of high-tech workers, I think it's a good thing for a country, because then these high-tech workers are like a resource for the country that can be used on other things and go and work for high-tech companies and stimulate the industry. So I think that there's a number of secondary reasons why we want to justify space, and we should continue to do.
Absolutely, and I'm curious as to whether there's a cataloguing of the benefits that come out, or whether that's a little bit retrospectively done by others. But as policy decisions are taken to fund, whether then there's a catalogue of benefits that can come back that explains to people, that says, well, this is why we did this and these were the benefits that came out. Not every investment ends up in reaping benefits, but the scale of the benefits can be absolutely enormous. And it's that kind of communication back to the population, which I think will ultimately be the thing that will excite people to start saying, yes, okay, that's fine in that case. Let's keep going in that direction.
This is a systematic effort that we do undertake. And in fact, just yesterday, so today is the 26th of July, so on the 25th of July, there was a release from the team managing the International Space Station at NASA, and they did this big project looking at the benefits, the broader benefits of investment in the International Space Station. And it covered a whole range of things like the spin-offs and the various technologies, the broader societal benefits, the inspirational nature of the project. And they wrote a book, and there's enough material there for a book. And this is just it's a very big project, but it's just one project, and you can catalog these things. And in fact, NASA, they have an annual report where they list or they find examples of the spin-offs that have resulted from NASA projects. So this is something that's done. But I think that it's also important to note that a lot of what goes on in the space sector is hidden to some extent. So I think a lot of the telecommunication side of things, this is just kind of infrastructure that no one really thinks about, but it's operating in the background. That's really important. And also, it's not just telecommunications, but all the Earth observation capabilities that we have. So we take it for granted these days that you can just go on your phone and get the weather. And this is coming from mainly from satellites that are in space in the background, providing value to us without realizing it. Yeah, I think we also need to get better about communicating these kind of hidden components, in addition to the ones that are really highly visible, the first boot on the moon, these amazing images coming from the
Absolutely.
telescopes.
And I have a number of friends and colleagues that work in the agricultural sector, and satellite data all the time for crops and things like that, which, that normally you wouldn't think about that, but actually the agricultural industry is using satellite information, couldn't really work anymore without it. And it's that connection of the benefits that is fascinating, but I still think very unclear to the majority of the population that's where it is. It's not just your iPhone works, it's that actually you've got better yields from crops of things that you eat. So it's very interesting times.
Yeah.
So
But then you could also ask the
go ahead.
reverse
Yeah.
question, sorry, just because this is something that kind of interests me, is that does the public actually need to know all the details? We could apply the same question. Do we need to know how the railway system works? Do we just want it to work at the end of the day? Or the whole infrastructure of like internet in the country, all the fiber optic cables and the routers and the cell phone, do we need to know how that works? And this is something that's really important for society, but we don't understand it.
Yeah,
So
it's great. It's a great question. It's
yeah, there's
finding that count. It's just that right pivot point, isn't it, between too much detail, not interested, and actually fascinating, therefore encouraged by it. And there is some part of policy which is actually delivering on defence policy and things like that, which you know is from a security point of view is not declared or not made terribly public. But it's finding that point to get. I think it's really interesting to find the point to make the general public, if that's not too pejorative a term, interested and encouraged without drowning them in detail that you're right, they just don't really need to know and don't care. Yeah. Of the things that you can see coming either in your personal endeavors or more broadly in the space industry inside maybe the next time frame of maybe 5 years, what do you see as the kind of really interesting things that are going on at the moment?
Yeah, I've mentioned some of the various projects like in-space manufacturing, space-based solar power, the growth of the low Earth orbit satellite constellations. And I think that we'll start to see these various projects being connected in different ways to really have a new type of economy that's taking place in low Earth orbit. And actually, just today, it was announced that one of the major satellite constellation companies in low Earth orbit, OneWeb, is going to merge with one of the more established players in the geostationary orbit, EU-Telsat, and create this sort of hybrid entity, which unlocks all sorts of new possibilities. So I think these are some interesting developments. But where I'm looking, and maybe it's not so exciting in a way, but it's essential for the sector, is to have all this regulated and governed in a proper way. And this is something that is extremely challenging because of the nature of space, the fact that an object that's in space is going around the Earth and it can have an impact over the whole world rather than just the domain of one particular country. So in order to set some basic rules and regulations, ultimately it requires that the majority of spacefaring countries actually agree to it and create some common framework. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that the sector faces overall. And then from this, there's various kind of sub-challenges. So one of them is having a proper system for space traffic management. So right now we have a system on Earth, a globally agreed system to manage air traffic control, but we don't have such a system for space. And I think as the number of objects is increasing, as the number of things like space-based solar power, building giant structures in low Earth orbit, we really need to have a proper system for space traffic management. And then another aspect is the topic of sustainability. How do we ensure that what we're doing in space is sustainable such that it allows the environment to be there in the long run? So we don't fill it with space junk and and debris and render certain parts of the orbits unusable for future generations. So I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we will have to solve
Yeah, I
in the
agree.
next couple
And
of years.
do you think we've reached or when do you think we'll reach a point of a real problem with the amount of debris that is now in Earth orbit? Is there still a few years to go before we've got a real problem, or are we right on top of it now?
Yeah, it's one of these situations that the problem plays out over decades, if not hundreds of years. And if you look at the projections, if we just continue roughly on the same rate of business, in 300 years' time, it could be very difficult to operate in certain regions of low Earth orbit. It won't be impossible because space is still really big, but there'll be an increasing rate of collisions. The insurers of all these space projects will be wanting higher rates, and companies will be having to take many more measures to ensure the spacecraft can operate in this environment that they wouldn't have to do if we'd just taken care of the environment and cleaned it up. There's no sort of one clear threshold of where a particular change takes place. And it also depends on the orbit. Lower Earth orbits, they're filling up much more rapidly. The Starlink constellation by SpaceX, a Musk project, they're talking about 40,000 satellites in low Earth orbit. That's a huge number. But of course, at that orbital altitude, the objects have a decay rate that is quite rapid. So within 5 to 10 years, they will deorbit naturally and just burn up in the atmosphere. Whereas the higher up you go, the longer this takes. So the constellations that are there at 1,000 kilometers, these things, if they're not dealt with properly, they are there for thousands of years, floating around, colliding with each other, and being a kind of legacy problem for the next 10 generations to deal with. But then there's another kind of aspect that we also need to start thinking about, and this is the impact of the environment on Earth. If you imagine Elon Musk's constellation, so you've got 40,000 objects, the average lifetime of a single satellite is 5 to 7 years. You can just see that in order to keep the constellation full, they're going to have to replenish a couple of satellites every single week, because over 5 to 7 years, a substantial fraction of them will just be ending their life and burning up in the atmosphere. And what this means is that every day there'll be literally tons of spacecraft burning up in the upper atmosphere, and this is depositing, tons of aluminium into the upper atmosphere. And we don't understand what that does for Earth. So I think that's something that we really should be looking at. And then the other impact, and this is going close to my own heart and kind of work, is the impact on ground-based astronomy. Before 2019, we had 10 to 100 satellites overhead at any one time. It happened occasionally that the images would be contaminated by satellites. But if Starlink, OneWeb, Amazon Kuiper, and the Chinese constellations all come to fruition, then at any one point on Earth, when you look up, there'll be about 5,000 satellites overhead at any one time. Now, you won't be able to see them all at one time because it depends on how the sun is reflecting off them. But this is a substantial change then to astronomy. It's going to have a serious impact, and that's something that the operators don't have to consider. They don't have to do anything because there's no laws that tell them that they have to do something. So this is something that we're working on.
If there was one thing that you could say to maybe young people who are thinking about getting involved in in the space industry in some way, what would you suggest? How would you encourage them to go ahead and find out more about it and maybe get involved?
So I think the natural place to start is to study a scientific or engineering subject, even though what I was saying earlier was that there's many more opportunities in law and policy, social sciences. I still think having a solid technical understanding is a really helpful starting point when you want to branch out into other areas. And there's a number of opportunities that are growing, particularly with the European Space Agency. They have some excellent schemes for young people. So they've got a graduates training scheme, it's called, and they take up about 100 people, I think, each year to go and do an internship at ESA. There's also an organization called the Space Generation Advisory Council, which is aiming at people under the age of 30 just to try and get them involved in the space sector, and they can volunteer to work on different projects. And I think that's also a fantastic opportunity. Yeah, there are many growing opportunities out there, and of course, as the number of space companies increase, the number of government positions dealing with the sector is increasing, so there'll just be many more opportunities coming down the line. And also, we're starting to see this realization that there's such a huge dependency on data that's coming from space. So you mentioned the agriculture, but it's also the logistics companies, it's the insurance companies, and that I think you'll start to see many sort of earth-based sectors start to open up space-related jobs to deal with the data that's coming from space and to seek opportunities from it. So I think that's another interesting possibility to become involved in space, albeit the downstream applications.
Absolutely, not everybody needs to be an astronaut. Andrew, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Would love to meet up with you again at a conference or an event, of which there's many, and maybe we can share a coffee.
No, thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you.